our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun.
Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's UnSpun. In today's episode, we're going to get at the story behind the story, understanding the role of metaphor in things newsmakers say and show you. We'll learn some common tricks for that and some ideas to help you ferret out facts in a world of images. But first, a reminder of an offer for you. You have a chance to participate up through the end of April, because I would really love to get some feedback from my truth seekers on what's working and how I can make it better for you. So, if you'd complete a short 9-question questionnaire at bit.ly/unspun survey, unspun survey all one word, you can leave your email at the end, and I'll pick 2 responses to get a signed copy of one of my books. One is a copy of Detecting Deception Tools to Fight Fake News. If you enjoy the real news examples on the pod, you're going to like this one, because it talks about a lot of the logical shenanigans newsmakers get up to, with real examples that let you test your skills at finding the foolishness. And the other is a copy of We Are AltGov, Social Media Resistance from the Inside. This is a story of the U.S. Twitter accounts from government workers and others who stood up a disaster rescue after hurricanes, told people about chances to weigh in on government policies, and more. One reviewer even called it riveting. So, anyway, if those sound interesting to you, or if you don't want to leave an email and you just want a better podcast, please consider visiting bit.ly/unspun survey to tell me what you think. Okay, let's get unspun. A politician in a dark suit and a blue tie with an American flag pin on the lapel steps up to the podium in front of a cheering crowd, and he's marking a historic moment because he's just secured enough delegates to win his party's nomination for president. And as is normal at such times, he starts to speak.
And all those watching tonight from beyond our shores, from parliaments and palaces, to those who are huddled around radios in the forgotten corners of the world, our stories are singular, but our destiny is shared. And a new dawn of American leadership is at hand.
What you just heard wasn't a political victory speech. It was a masterclass in metaphor. Listen closely. This was Barack Obama, and he didn't just list his policies or his achievements. He framed the night and the campaign itself as part of a journey, sort of a collective movement toward a larger destiny. And throughout his speech, and really throughout his career, Obama tapped into what scholars call the myth of the American dream. He didn't name it outright, but he wove vivid metaphors through that suggested momentum and movement and moral progress. One of the most powerful lines from his era was his frequent invocation of bending the arc of history. And in that single phrase, Obama conjures a vivid image. History is not something we suffer through passively, it's something we shape, right? It's something we bend. Today, we're going to dive into how political figures, like Obama and others, use metaphor, visuals, and emotional resonance to shape not just our opinions, but our very sense of what's possible. At its core, a metaphor isn't just decorative language. It's a powerful tool that helps us understand one thing by comparing it to something else. And in this process, we kind of map the ideas from a familiar area, the source domain, onto something newer, more complicated, the target domain. So for example, if a politician says that a place is a shining city on a hill, they're using the familiar image of a bright, visible city, that's the source, to explain how they want the place to be seen as a model for others, that's the target. And in newsmaker communication, metaphors aren't just for style, but they actually shape how you think about issues. They highlight certain ideas and they hide others in order to support a particular point of view. So for example, if you call taxes a burden, That focuses attention on what is lost when you pay taxes, not what you gain from the money that you spent. Metaphors are also really important in myth-making, so they help craft stories that make political ideas feel like they're natural or heroic or even inevitable. They help create consistent, believable stories about politicians in the world they promise to shape. Politicians use metaphors in both words and images to persuade people, to stir their emotions, and even to rally support. So here's some examples. What do you think of when you think of an army? When someone says they want an army of teachers, they don't really mean a literal military force, right? But instead, they're using a metaphor to suggest a large and organized and determined group of educators who are working together toward a common goal. The word army itself, it kind of implies discipline and strength and unity. So it suggests that teachers would be mobilized like soldiers, but in service of education. It frames teachers not just as workers, but as agents in a collective mission. And depending on the context, the metaphor could emphasize urgency, right, as in a battle for better education, or national importance, teachers as key defenders of the country's future, or the need for a massive coordinated effort. And I think in this case, it was all three. Here's another example.
And the United States of America. Ladies and gentlemen, this is no time for generalities, and I will venture to be precise. A shadow had fallen upon the scenes so lately lighted by the Allied victory.
So during World War II, between September 1940 and May 1941, Britain endured this really terrifying period known as the Blitz, because night after night, German bombers dropped on British cities, with London taking the biggest hit, and entire neighborhoods were just reduced to rubble. There were thousands of civilians killed, and many people were left homeless. And there was deep fear and really uncertainty about whether Britain was going to survive. And so you heard the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. And in his speeches during this period, Churchill often used the imagery of light and darkness to describe the struggle. When he talked about light, he was referring to hope and freedom and resilience and moral clarity, the idea that Britain and its allies stood for something good and lasting. But darkness, on the other hand, that was the threat of the Nazi, right? Tyranny, oppression, despair. And Churchill's use of this metaphor wasn't just poetic, it was also strategic. Because in order to keep bombs from falling on houses, they would black out the windows. So in the middle of blacked out cities and bombed homes and daily terror, calling Britain the light framed their suffering as part of a noble cause. It reassured people that even though their cities were literally living in darkness with the city lights off to avoid those enemy planes, their struggle was lighting the way toward a better future. And so by linking Britain's survival to the broader fight between light and darkness, Churchill made an abstract political conflict deeply personal and emotional. He turned ordinary citizens into participants in a moral battle bigger than they were. Metaphors can also evoke stronger emotions than literal expressions. So for example, if you say a tsunami of immigrants, what you're saying is that immigration is a natural disaster, and that's likely to spur more fear than simply stating a number. So politicians and other newsmakers will strategically use images, often combined with text, to disseminate their ideas and kind of persuade their audiences. Presidential campaign ads, for example, often use crime metaphors, and they depict crime not just as a concept, but as a dark stain or a lurking shadow through a specific imagery. Candidates can then brand themselves as sheriffs or janitors who are cleaning up, and so they're taking cultural models and emotional pain to get people to be loyal and secure their votes. So a critical example for us is what assumptions underlie a metaphor when you hear it. So take crime, for example. Crime itself is a really complex social phenomenon. It's messy, there's a bunch of layers to it, it's often tied to a whole bunch of different causes. But in political talk, crime is rarely presented as being a complex issue. Instead, it's just kind of mapped onto these concrete, vivid images, which let people process it emotionally instead of analytically. One of the best places to see this at work is in political advertising. Ever since campaigns have been televised, ads have become really powerful for turning symbolic rhetoric into really striking visuals. Political visuals don't just show a message, they shape how you feel about it, because they pull from these really deep cultural associations that you have. They pull on what you're afraid of, and they use imagery to have this really lasting emotional impact. You can think about presidential campaign ads from 1952 to 2016. This has been studied to show how crime has been showed as a visual metaphor over time. And there were two main patterns that showed up. The first was crime as a dark stain. In this way, crime was portrayed like a spreading contamination, something that just kind of dirties the fabric of society. And ads using this metaphor will often show pictures of tarnish or decay, marking crime as something separate or unclean or in need of removal. Crime is also described as a lurking shadow, and this version frames crime as a hidden threat, right? It's a constant danger that's haunting your otherwise safe community. You might have visuals of shadowy figures moving in the background with a lone police officer surrounded by darkness, or, inmates depicted as zombies or silhouettes. The message is clear. Danger is just out of sight and it's growing. But these visuals aren't chosen randomly. They have specific purposes, and one of them is branding a candidate. So through these kind of metaphors, candidates are cast as heroes who are ready to clean up the mess. If it's a stain, they're the person with the mop. If the crime is a lurking shadow, they're the fearless sheriff or the person with a flashlight. And it taps into these cultural images of heroes confronting chaos. And another goal is to mobilize voters. These visual crime metaphors evoke fear and anger and disgust. And these are emotions that do tend to, inspire people to show up at the polls. So they don't just inform people. The selection of images and music and sound effects, it kind of stirs people up. And visual metaphors also help with framing and simplification. So complex issues like crime and civil unrest or drug addiction are condensed into very simple threats. So all the nuance goes away. Instead of thinking about what causes crime, you're more seen as crime as a looming kind of dehumanized enemy. It's important to recognize that crime is a political issue that shows up and then goes away. While real-world shifts in crime rates sometimes influence political messaging, campaigns will often use these crime metaphors during times when they want people to be more politically paranoid or it's kind of strategically useful. And I will say it is both parties that have done this at different times, which shows kind of the emotional power of that crime rhetoric. Understanding how those metaphors operate and why they're so effective, it's not just an academic exercise either. It's a critical tool for being a better media consumer. I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, I want to talk a little bit more about the aspect of metaphor that is visuals. I'll be right back. Welcome back. If you live in the United States, you can probably recognize Firebrand Congressmember Marjorie Taylor Greene when you see her. Even without hearing her distinctive Southern accent, the Georgia representative is pretty easy to spot in a picture with her long blonde hair and her big smile. And there was a picture of her accompanying a New York Times story this week. In the picture, she's sporting a bright red cap. You probably know the model. Instead of saying "Make America Great Again," though, it said Trump was right about everything. The picture went with a story about a new suspension of enforcement for the federal Hatch Act. Now, the Hatch Act makes it so that if you work for the government, you can't use time and money from the government to campaign for future elections. Basically, you can't use your government job to keep your government job. This was a weird photo choice for the Times to have to go with this story, though, because members of Congress are not subject to the Hatch Act. And the article said that it was specifically the wearing of Making America Great apparel that was not going to be enforced. So if people wanted to wear that at work, they could, and it would not be considered an enforcement by the administration right now. But in any case, that red Make America Great Again hat is an example of a visual metaphor. That hat stands for the Make America Great movement, and you can find it in a lot of forms, including, hats, stickers, even Christmas tree ornaments. Visual metaphors are a way of using images to express ideas. So they take these abstract or complicated political concepts and make them easier to see and understand. Unlike words, which can label even the most complex ideas directly, visuals need to turn the ideas into something concrete. So they use symbols or familiar images that people easily picture, and they're often drawn from everyday life or shared experiences we have. There's several ways that you can create them. One method is called visual fusion, where you have two different ideas or images and they blend into a single picture that still shows recognizable parts of both. And another is unexpected replacement, where you take a familiar image and you change it in a surprising or an unusual way to suggest a new meaning. And so in a broader sense, visual metaphors can also come from the way images and words are arranged together. It may not just be a single picture, it may be a whole setup, a combination of elements. And all of those things together shape how we understand an issue. For example, you may see a candidate in a campaign ad, and you may see several visual elements in that ad. There may be an American flag in the background. The candidate may be wearing camouflage and carrying a gun, right? And those things symbolize patriotism and rural America. Okay. The way that people interpret metaphors depends a lot on their background, what they already know, their emotions, and what they already believe. So the same visual can mean different things to different people, depending on what they already think or feel. And in practice, especially in media like advertisements and political cartoons and propaganda, visual metaphors take complex ideas and they translate them into really simple, emotionally powerful images. They carry these hidden meanings, and they kind of tap into emotions more effectively than just words would. They frame a subject in a specific way, and they boil down those complicated issues into a single image to capture its essence. And they can show power, they can show who's vulnerable just by spatial arrangement, they can show whole metaphor scenarios without saying anything explicitly. Political cartoons are a specific example of an art form that relies heavily on visual metaphors. These cartoons might seem like simple sketches, and they're easy to overlook in the age of video and social media where we have a meme a minute. But these images and the visual metaphors inside them are really powerful tools for shaping how we see politicians. They're more than just jokes or commentary. They serve a deeper purpose because they take these complex political ideas and make them easier to understand. At their core, political cartoons and other visual metaphors work through what we call framing and simplification. So we take complex ideas about a politician's policies or character or leadership style, and we boil it down into something we can immediately grasp. It's sort of a cognitive shortcut, connecting abstract political behaviors to familiar everyday things. So here's an example. There's a famous cartoon of Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, and it shows him balancing on a tightrope, juggling the Union, the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves, and the war effort. So without a single word, the cartoon made the precariousness of Lincoln's position really visible and vivid. It was just one image, but it framed all those challenges that he faced while highlighting how cautious he had to be to manage them. Cartoons and other campaign visuals also provide character clues and help build a politician's brand. So they'll merge a candidate's likeness with symbols pulled from pop culture or history or even animal imagery to suggest deeper truths about their personality. You can think of the portrayals of Richard Nixon as a shady, looming figure with dark glasses and hunched shoulders, or political cartoons during the Trump presidency, which sometimes show him as a bloated king or emperor on top of a golden throne, which is a visual metaphor suggesting authoritarianism and self-importance. Campaign ads use similar techniques. So, for example, portraying a candidate as a sheriff riding into town evokes a whole set of American cultural myths about law and order and rugged individualism. In contrast, if you depict the opponent as a janitor cleaning up a mess, as Democratic ads did for Joe Biden in 2020, this is a different kind of cultural model that emphasizes restoration and humble, steady service. But beyond simplifying and branding, visuals also evoke strong emotions, often more strong than written text. And so we have something called political iconography, which taps into feelings like hope and fear and pride and anger. We started the episode with an example from Barack Obama. And in the 2008 Obama campaign, there were posters showing Obama's face lit in bold red, white, and blue hues with the word hope underneath that were kind of iconic. So the image didn't say much. It was just one word. But it stirred optimism and collective aspiration. And on the opposite side, anti-immigration ads have sometimes depicted immigrants as faceless crowds or shadowy figures moving en masse. And that's really designed to stir anxiety and fear. Cartoons and other visual metaphors are really essential for critiquing and exposing political traits. They're the sharp edge of political dissent, taking leaders who try to project strength and exposing their weaknesses. For example, there were cartoons from the 1930s that showed Hitler as a small, ridiculous figure riding a giant bomb. Or there's more recent cartoons showing authoritarian leaders wearing masks of democracy, right? So they're smiling on the outside, but they've got darker intentions underneath. These warn audiences about hidden motives. And they don't just shape how politicians are understood, they also influence voter evaluation in some subtle but important ways. Research has shown that a candidate's posture, their facial expression, or even how they're dressed in campaign imagery can send powerful signals. For example, during the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon debates, the first televised presidential debates in the U.S., Many radio listeners thought Nixon won based on the arguments, but television viewers overwhelmingly thought that Kennedy won. How come? Because Kennedy looked confident, he was poised and healthy looking, and Nixon looked sweaty and uncomfortable. So the visual impression changed how people judged their leadership qualities, even when the words stayed the same. The power of these visuals depends on the viewer's own background. A cartoon showing a politician as a heroic cowboy might stir admiration in some, and other people might make fun of it. Visual metaphors are interpreted through the lens of personal beliefs, cultural background, and your existing political opinions. And while they can help people understand complex ideas more quickly, they can also be used to manipulate because they bypass logical reason and tap straight into those emotional reactions. And campaigns will carefully pick everything from an ad's imagery, to its colors, to its background music, to evoke exactly the feeling they want from voters, whether that's pride or anger. Okay, truth seekers, let's do an exercise together. I'm going to describe a political cartoon, and I want you to picture it in your mind as we think through the metaphors and try to see how it's shaping your emotions and beliefs. Ready? Here comes the description. So it's a picture of a giant shaking donkey, the traditional symbol for the Democratic Party, and it's standing nervously in front of a wide-open border fence. The donkey's got a clipboard in his mouth labeled policy ideas, but all the pages are blowing away in the wind. In the background, there's chaos, there's crowds pushing through the broken fence, and the donkey looks frozen and indecisive. Okay, let's break it down. What's the main metaphor? We know that the donkey doesn't look strong or confident. Instead, it looks timid and overwhelmed and ineffective. The open fence could be a metaphor for weak or absent leadership, suggesting that borders and, by extension, national control are falling apart because the Democrats can't act. What emotion is the cartoon trying to stir? The idea of the papers flying away and the donkey looking helpless, it invites feelings of anxiety, maybe frustration, and it's designed to stir the fear that important systems are collapsing while leaders are too weak to act. So third, how does it frame the issue? Well, it doesn't engage with the real complexity of immigration policy, but it simplifies it into a crisis of competence, right? The open fence isn't a nuanced political debate. It's just a symbol of failure and neglect. So the viewer is nudged to see the problem caused entirely by Democratic leadership. Now, how might different people interpret this? Well, if you believe the Democratic Party mishandles immigration, the cartoon would probably feel like a justified critique. But if you support the Democrats, you might see the cartoon as unfairly simplistic, ignoring all the trade-offs involved in border policy. So the point is this. Political cartoons don't just present information, they frame it. So they push you to feel a certain way, quickly, emotionally, and without much debate. So if you slow down and notice the metaphors, you can choose how much you let these emotional shortcuts influence your thinking. And it's not just pictures. Sound can matter too. We have TV shows here about funny videos, for example, where the producers solicit videos from people's homes and they put funny music or funny narration over kind of ordinary things like people falling down. We've seen how visuals can frame complex ideas in powerful emotional ways, but music can also act as a kind of metaphor, according to research. In fact, some scholars argue that music can contain monomodal metaphors, meaning that the metaphor exists purely within the music itself, and you don't even need the words or pictures. And though there's still some debate about whether purely musical metaphors should be treated differently, the idea is clear, that music can suggest emotions and meanings by the way it sounds. Sometimes it will emerge when the music is paired with other media. So you can imagine a political ad showing ordinary citizens going about their lives. If the soundtrack underneath it is a military march like the Stars and Stripes Forever, a song associated with patriotism, even without saying a word, the music projects meaning onto the images. You can imagine that now with maybe Yakety Sax, right? That song from the Benny Hill Show, and the mood changes again. Becomes silly. Music isn't just an emotional background, it's been studied as a key tool in campaign advertising. They've done analyses of TV ads, and researchers have found that music sometimes plays a direct role in kind of fixing the emotions that voters have. Some ads use uplifting melodies or somber melodies to show how you feel about a candidate's message. So for example, in one ad known as Mother and Child, a woman talks about violence while a hummed lullaby plays in the background. And the combination of voice and music turns personal reflection into something haunting and really emotional, even though most of their ads from the same candidate didn't use music at all. Music doesn't just entertain, it speaks and it frames and it resists. truth. Just like visuals and language, it creates metaphors that shape how we think and what we feel about the world around us. Just to show how powerful that framing can be, we're going to try an experiment. I'm going to have a piece of narration 2 times, but each time with different music underneath. Listen carefully and notice how the meaning and the emotional weight shift.
Growing up in a small town shaped by factory closures and shifting economies, she learned early what resilience meant. Her parents worked multiple jobs, struggling at times to make ends meet, but they instilled in her a deep belief in the value of education and service. After putting herself through college with scholarships and part-time work, she returned home to advocate for policies that would give other families the opportunities hers nearly lost. Her story, she says, is not just about personal success. It's about the possibility of renewal for communities too often left behind. Growing up in a small town shaped by factory closures and shifting economies, she learned early what resilience meant. Her parents worked multiple jobs, struggling at times to make ends meet, but they instilled in her a deep belief in the value of education and service. After putting herself through college with scholarships and part-time work, she returned home to advocate for policies that would give other families the opportunities hers nearly lost. Her story, she says, is not just about personal success. It's about the possibility of renewal for communities too often left behind.
I hope you could notice that in one, the person who's being talked about, it seems kind of hopeful and aspirational. In the other, it seems kind of sad and pathetic, right? All right. So we've had a lot of fun thinking about different types of metaphor this week, Truth Seekers. But we also need to consider that sometimes metaphors can be dangerous. For example, when a policymaker compares human beings to animals, that kind of dehumanization, that simplification, can really affect the audience. They can start thinking of the lives of certain people as being worth less than their own. When politicians compare basic policy disagreements to tyranny, this can inspire people to take violent action when verbal disagreement might be a better choice. So it's important that you learn to recognize this kind of manipulative exaggeration, because it can shut down real debate and understanding. So how do we do that? First, question the assumptions. Whenever you hear a political message, whether it's a speech or a commercial or even a meme, ask yourself, what is this message assuming I already believe? So, for example, a campaign ad might say, we need to take back our country. But take back from whom? Was it stolen? The ad never says. It assumes you already feel something has been lost. So if you question those hidden assumptions, you pull back the curtain on the story you're being asked to accept. And then you can decode the visuals, because those images aren't just a decoration. They're doing a lot of heavy lifting in the persuasion. You can look at what's shown, what's left out, how everything's arranged. So for example, imagine a news photo showing a politician standing in front of a giant flag, smiling, surrounded by a diverse group of citizens. That's a deliberate visual metaphor. There's patriotism from the flag, this hope from the smiling, and there's unity from the group of people. Now imagine another image of the same politician, but he's isolated, caught mid-blink under harsh lighting. It's the same person, but it's an entirely different story. So when you decode visuals, you're reading the unspoken word of an image. Finally, recognize that emotion-triggering language. Look for words that are designed to hit you in the gut rather than the brain. Words like betrayal or hero or flood or crisis or nightmare. These are not neutral descriptions. They're loaded with emotional meaning. If we describe new immigrant arrivals as a flood, it doesn't just say something about numbers. It frames people as a natural disaster, something overwhelming and dangerous. Recognizing this kind of language helps you spot when you're being nudged to feel a certain way without necessarily thinking it through. And together, these habits help you stay grounded. Have a great week, Truth Seekers, and stay sharp.
Thanks for getting UnSpun with me this week. UnSpun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.